It's been about 10 days since I sprayed the last coat of lacquer on this guitar. And if you try and smell the guitar a little bit, it still has a very faint whiff of lacquer, but it has smelled like this for the last couple of days. And so I'm fairly confident that it's pretty much as dry as it's going to be, or at least as dry as I'm willing to wait for. Overall, my spray technique has gotten a lot better with this guitar. It looks like it's going to take a lot less wet sanding than some of my previous attempts with lacquer. But there's one area that I'm really interested in seeing how it's going to turn out. And you can see in the lacquer here, hopefully, that it almost looks like a smiley face. What had happened here is I got a really bad run, and I went and I scraped it off with a razor, which took the finish down quite a bit. Then I sprayed over it again with the TV yellow, and then sprayed all the lacquer onto it. And so, when you rub your hand over it, you can barely feel it. I don't have a good feeling about, how deep it is in terms of the depth. And so I'm going to see if I can polish this out. Now, when I was talking to my wife about this, she was saying, this guitar might actually look really cool with a very subtle relic, vintage type aging. I think she might be right, but for right now, I'm going to try and make this paint look as good as possible, at least for the practice. And then, after I see the guitar, or maybe even once in the future, maybe I'll consider doing that. And so I'm going to do a whole lot of time lapse here. Watching me sand isn't that impressive, but I look forward to seeing what the end result looks like. I started off with 800 grit, and it wasn't going as fast as I wanted, and so I dropped down to 400 grit, and that made a little bit quicker work of the level sanding. There's definitely a couple of pock marks that aren't going to come out, at least with level sanding. I'd rather leave the slightly shiny areas and come back later and maybe locally smooth them out instead of having it completely flat. But overall, I'm definitely pretty pleased, at least with the back, on how the lacquer has come out. Another amazing thing when I'm looking at this is I sprayed 2 sealer coats from an aerosol can. The can said not to do more than 2, but what constitutes a coat is always a little questionable. And you can already see as you go in here that some of the grain is starting to show through. That doesn't bother me at all, but it is really interesting to realize that I put 2 sealer coats, 2 cans of TV yellow, and 3 cans of lacquer, clear lacquer, and it still isn't built up to where it's a very smooth finish. And so, like I said, it doesn't bother me. This is definitely the best I've done so far with lacquer. So I'm gonna keep going on the sides, do the neck, headstock, and everything else. With 400, and then bump up to 800 and 1,000 and 1,500 and all those different grits. Had the first casualty of using 400 grit. As I believe I mentioned before, it is pretty aggressive to sand lacquer down with 400 grit. And what ended up happening is, if I can get it here, I sanded through, and so I sanded through the clear coat, sanded through the paint just briefly. I'm still trying to do the absolute best job I can. This type of error doesn't bother me. Edges are always one of those things that you need to be careful about so that you're not sanding through everywhere. But in this case, the same thing with headstocks. I mean, they get banged around. That is kind of a natural wear position. And so using 400 on the body, on the flat parts, hasn't been an issue yet. I was able to get the smiley face out of the guitar which I'm really happy about. And so, using 400 right now has been a net positive. I just need to do the sides a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to 800 to start working on some of the finer areas around here, and also to do the fretboard. I finished wet sanding the body to 1000 grit, and I was wet sanding the fretboard to 800 when I started getting concerned about how much water I was actually using. And so I let this dry overnight and then sanded the fretboard with 1000 grit just dry. At 1000 grit, you're essentially polishing, and so it wasn't creating a ton of dust anyway. One thing I have come to the conclusion about is I don't think for the next guitar that I do, or at least the ones with the maple neck, the maple fretboard, is that I don't think I'm going to fret it first and then spray the lacquer over it. My Fender Strat definitely has the clear shot over the frets, but it ends up being a real hassle trying to get in there, especially in some of the higher frets here, trying to smooth out the areas. The neck is going to be just fine. The fretboard has a few shiny areas. I'm pretty sure as soon as I start playing with this guitar, they're going to get rubbed away. And so the next step is really to start breaking out the automotive products. I did have one more sanding casualty. I must have really sprayed the headstock thin, because even with 800 I was able to sand through here. And so I have this one, and then I have the two here that are sand throughs. But otherwise I was able to sand through, or excuse me, I was able to smooth out almost everything I was looking for. There are some areas here you can see that are essentially grain holes. I say this a lot, that doesn't bother me, but it doesn't. The TV yellow finish apparently does have lots of grain, and so I didn't do it the right way, where you're supposed to highlight the grain with wood filler after lacquer but before sanding or something. But there are definitely some areas here where the grain is lower than it could be. A couple of pock marks that I remember were in the sapele. And so now I'm going to move on to doing the car polishing compounds on here, and then we'll be able to move on to assembling the guitar. After the Meguiar's medium cut cleaner step, there isn't a whole lot for me to complain about. You can see that there's a nice reflection building up in the lacquer. As I mentioned before, there's going to be some dents in grain areas. You're going to be hard pressed to differentiate between regular play wear or shop wear in a couple of months. Once I actually start using this guitar. And so, I'm super happy with how this is turning out. And so the next thing I'm going to do is actually let this rest for however long. I'm going to go back to work, just in case I soften up the lacquer in any way with the medium cut cleaner. Then I'll come back with a swirl removing compound, and after that we can start assembling the guitar. I'm done applying the swirl remover to the paint, And now that I see it, if this is the worst guitar finish I ever do, I'm going to have a really fun time in this hobby. As you can see against the light here, it's a very, very reflective, very shiny finish. You can kind of see those areas that I was talking about before about the wood grain. But overall, for the first time really trying to paint a guitar, do a painted neck, painted headstock, I'm really pleased on how this turned out. And so I have a couple things to do, and so I probably won't get to putting this together for a few days. And so I'm going to let this hang, let the lacquer firm up if it needs to, and then I'll be on to assembling the guitar and working on the doing the fret dressing and all those things. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell to get notified when I have new content, and I'll see you next time.